Can we all hear? Perfect, this is great. I'll take my mask off also. Yeah, I don't think the Commons would have been able to accommodate this great audience that we have today. So my name is Emma Fraser. I'm an executive committee member at the Berkeley Centre for New Media, which we call BCNM. And I'm also an assistant teaching professor in media studies and the BCNM. So before we start off tonight, just a few housekeeping things, some reminders, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do at BCNM. So firstly, just to let you know, hopefully this isn't news to anyone, but in case it is, we will be filming and photographing this event. So if you do not want to be included in that, please grab a sticker if you don't want to be photographed this evening. I also wanted to share that we will have a Q&A following Gillian's lecture, and everyone will have an opportunity to ask a question, but we will ask you all to speak up just for the recording, and I'll repeat your questions back as well. So just make sure if you're asking a question that we can hear you. So lastly as well, we're celebrating tonight, in part because this is our first in-person event in this series since COVID, which is, yeah. So to celebrate this, we will have a reception with some Thai food and drinks immediately following the lecture, but I would say that this is quite a significant turnout. So there will be food, but there may not be quite enough for absolutely everyone. So I think take it in the spirit that it's intended. And so do stick around and walk to the terrace with us after the event ends, but again, with the caveat that we'll see how far the food stretches. Okay, so firstly, about BCNM. So the Berkeley Centre for New Media is an interdisciplinary research centre that studies and shapes media transition and emergence from diverse perspectives. Through critical thinking and making, we cultivate technological fairness and equity in our classrooms, in our communities, and on the internet. Our History and Theory of New Media lecture series promotes new interdisciplinary approaches to questions about the uses, meanings, causes, and effects of rapid or dramatic shifts in techno-infrastructure, information management, and forms of mediated expression. I would also like to do a land acknowledgement this evening. BCNM commits to supporting Indigenous sovereignty. We recognise that BCNM is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, specifically the Confederated Villages of Leshon. The history of prolific technological development in this region, as in every region, has always depended on the land, and all of our technological infrastructures and activities take place here today on and in relation to this land. So, on to the introductions. Tonight, I'm pleased to introduce Gillian Rose, today's speaker. I'm very glad that you're all here to celebrate her work while she's visiting at UC Berkeley. Gillian Rose is a professor of human geography at the University of Oxford and a fellow of the British Academy and the Academy of Social Sciences. She's the author of Feminism and Geography, 1993, Doing Family Photography, which is 2010, Visual Methodologies, which I think some of our undergraduate students would know quite well. So there's a new edition of that coming out this year, so that's exciting. This year has also seen the publication of a book co-written with Monica Dagan, The New Urban Aesthetic, Digital Experiences of Urban Change, as well as the collection of essays Seeing the City Digitally with Amsterdam University Press, and I would recommend both of those if you haven't looked at those already. She's also written many papers on images, visualising technologies and ways of seeing in urban, domestic and archival spaces, and her current research interests focus on contemporary digital visual culture and how cities are seen and experienced. So please welcome Gillian Rose to BCNM.
Thank you, Emma, for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good, thank you. Okay, so thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to give this lecture. I'm honoured that I'm here, especially this first in-person meeting after so long. Very much clear everybody's there for that. I'm just a kind of excuse, so I'll take that. I do also, though, want to thank the Department of Geography for hosting me as a visiting scholar. I've, at the end of what for me has been a quite intense 3 years as head of the largest geography department in the UK, actually, Much as I love my wonderful colleagues there, it has been very amazing to leave them behind and to come here and to meet with many of you. I can see some familiar faces in the audience already, to be reading a lot and learning from the amazing community of scholars you have here at Berkeley. So thank you for all of that. Now, what I've been trying to do while I'm here is to think about the outline of a new project, a research project, which I'm calling Animated Urbanism. Now, some parts of that project are already in place. Emma mentioned some of them already, partly in a couple of books, The New Urban Aesthetic, that some of you will have heard me talk about with Monica when she visited geography a few weeks ago. And that looks at the various ways in which urban regeneration projects are mediated by different kinds of digital devices and practices. And then there's also the edited collection, which gave this lecture its original title, which is available open access from Amsterdam University Press. I paid quite a lot to have it made open access, so please do go and download it multiple times and enjoy its excellent contents. And the third book is the 5th edition of Visual Methodologies, which is actually just already out. Now, you'll gather my various interests from those book titles. And one of my starting points is cities, or the city, or perhaps urbanism more generally. I'm really interested in how urban spaces are mediated by technologies, by discourses, by practices, and by effects, and how that mediation organises various formations of urban spatiality and temporality. And even more specifically, I'm interested in the techniques and effects of various kinds of digital and visual mediation. And there are 1 or 2 seats still at the very front if you want to. I promise there's no audience participation, so you're safe in the front row. So I'm interested in the various kinds of digital and visual mediation in particular. And that interest started around a decade ago, because I guess you will have noticed I'm not a born digital native. So I came to this interest around a decade ago with a project that looked at how architects and developers worked with computer-generated images as part of the design and the marketing of a large urban redevelopment project in Doha, Qatar, and these are some of those CGIs. Now, since then, it seems to me that city spaces are increasingly pictured in more and more different domains, using more and more kinds of digitally generated images, most often designed to be seen on screens. These images are being made at higher and higher resolutions very often, and they're often animated now. And I'm thinking of things like, for example, the 3-dimensional geographical information system models and the urban digital twins that urban planners are increasingly using, the fly-throughs that are commissioned for new urban redevelopment projects, visual effects in movies and music videos, computer games, architectural renders, data visualizations, more recently augmented reality and virtual reality immersive experiences of urban spaces. And of course, we can also think of CCTV footage and satellite and drone views of cities, and the massive picturing in and of urban spaces on social media. So my larger project on animated urbanism eventually will look at a number of these sorts of digital images to think through their specificities and to think through the variety of temporal, spatial and embodied, I think, reorganisations of urban life, which the technological affordances of digital visuals are co-constituting with discourses and practices. Now, the book Seeing the City Digitally brings together a collection of chapters that do just that. Each chapter takes a particular example of an urban digital technology that creates some kind of visuals. And it thinks quite carefully about how each of those produces a different and particular configuration of urban space and time. So there are chapters on driverless cars, for example, on the Facebook pages of community activists, and on the WhatsApp messages that are sent between young women in order to navigate urban space safely. And when I first thought about doing this lecture, I thought I would just work through some of those chapters with you this evening. I've since changed my mind, and we'll see whether that's a good idea or not. But mostly because I think, they are great chapters. I'm very pleased with the collection, and I think you should read the chapters yourselves. As I say, I think they're great, and they're all open access. So do go read them. instead, what I've ended up doing, deciding to do for this evening, is to talk through another case study, one that I've been thinking around over the past few weeks. And the materials of this case study are a few animated advertisements that invoke and enact digital mediations of the urban. So we're going to be looking at some adverts. Now, I've used the word mediation a few times already, so I just want to clarify what I mean by that. And I'm drawing here on the work of Sarah Kember and Joanna Zielinska, who define mediation as, I quote, a multi-agential force that incorporates humans and machines, technologies and users, in an ongoing process of becoming with. Now, I amplify the notion of humans to think of humans as both discursive and embodied. And Kember and Zielinska continue to note that mediation then becomes a key trope for understanding and articulating our being in and becoming with the technological world, our emergence and ways of interacting with it, as well as the acts and processes of temporarily stabilizing the world into media, agents, relations, and networks. So what I want to explore this evening then are the agents and relations, in effect what kind of urban life emerges from this handful of adverts. And I'm going to start by giving you a fairly brief introduction to my approach to these adverts. And I then want to stage 3 different encounters with them to explore their complex mediatory work. Okay, so it's hardly new to suggest that we understand and experience the urban through technologies, discourses and practices, of course. There's a significant literature on the idea of the urban imaginary, for example, and lots of it explores different visual representations of urban space. In her excellent book on TV cities, for example, Charlotte Brunsden talks about how it's often argued that cinema is the medium of the modern city. Cinema has been seen both to express and to be symptomatic of city life, she says. In cinema, one can sit anonymously in a crowd, participating in a cultural form that, through its editing process, its visual shocks, its disparities of scale, and its uncontrollable pace, has been seen to embody the experience of modern city life. And other scholars have pointed to 19th century panoramas and museums and so on in similar terms. Brunsden, of course, adds TV to those media. She moves into 20th century. Sarah Barnes, in what I think is the best book on platform urbanism, has discussed how in the 19th and the 20th century, urban reformers and planners also used many kinds of images in an effort to produce accurate evidence on which to base urban reform and urban management. But the scholarship on the urban imaginary hasn't quite come to terms, I think, with digital urban mediations. I think that living in urban spaces saturated with data, software and digital devices, including our smartphones, but actually there are many more, that involves something a bit different from interpreting urban materialities through cultural representations that just happen now to be digital. I think digital mediation has some distinctive implications. Now, in a recent paper, Saya Riddell offers a clear statement of this by now fairly widely shared view that the saturation of urban space with digital data flows, in particular, one of its consequences is that it's heralding the end of representation as the theoretical term best able to understand how that technology is mediating those spaces. Now, clearly this is a large and complex theoretical discussion, but Riddell at least hones in quite precisely on Stuart Hall's account of representation as a process of semiotic encoding and decoding in which cultural meanings on offer in things like cinema or adverts hail people with particular identities and interpretations. She suggests that the integration of digital devices with their technical infrastructure and their constant harvesting of data from their users means that, in her words, what we have is not interpolation in any traditional rhetorical sense. We're not looking at the decoding anymore, but rather our bodies are being imperceptibly attached to globally reaching systems of digital tracing and data collection. Thus, rather than calling for our attention, computational technology, she says, get us. And in her rather striking title of her paper, she says it's no longer hey you there, but rather got you. Now, I agree, I think that inhabiting many urban spaces now entails many different forms of digital mediation. But Riedel goes a step further and also argues that this means that appearances, by which I think she means sort of perceptible encoded meanings that demand interpretive attention, that kind of appearance is less important now because the technical infrastructure, which is so important to digital mediation, isn't apparent, it's not perceptible, it's not visible. That's not how we are being got by this digital infrastructure. In contrast, though, I think appearances, which I'm glossing in this talk as digital images or visualizations, do continue to matter. And the contributors to seeing the city digitally would agree in various ways as well. So what I want to do for the rest of this talk, as I said, is to interrogate what the visual appearance of urban digital life looks like with the help of some recent advertisements, all of which picture the people in urban spaces that are obviously created digitally. All these ads use special effects, as we'll see. And several also picture the use of smartphone apps in particular, so that these ads are digital objects, in both their visual content and in their form. Now, I've chosen to work with ads partly because I enjoy working with ordinary and everyday kinds of imagery. I think it's important to do that. I think they're pervasive, and they're often much more interesting, I think, than they're given credit for, although I guess we'll decide that at the end of this talk. But I do want to be clear how I'm approaching these adverts this evening. So without doubt, I think advertising is an important part of the discursive constitution of contemporary city spaces. Adverts matter because, just as many scholars have argued, that city dwellers in the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century learned what it was to be urban and to be modern, in part by going to the cinema, as per Brunsden's comments that I quoted earlier. I would argue that adverts are also one of the many ways that we are learning to be post-human, perhaps, or at least to inhabit digitally mediated cities now. And advertising is also critical to the constitution of digital technologies and to their profits, of course. So in his discussion of what he calls the data imaginary, David Beer notes that adverts for data analytics companies don't just try to sell a product. They also advocate more generally and in quite consistent ways for the whole idea of data-led innovation and decision-making. So adverts are one way in which specific tech products are sold then, but they're also part of how the apparent value of digital technology itself is constituted more broadly. So I'm going to approach these adverts in the same spirit. They're saying something about digital urban life more broadly. However, while I'm going to make claims about what these ads are articulating, I'm not suggesting that that's necessarily what their audiences will take from them. I'm paying them a very different kind of attention, very different from, for example, someone who just glances at them as they scroll through their phone, or maybe sees them once in a commercial break during a Super Bowl game on a TV screen in a sports bar. I'm not exploring how audiences themselves might engage with these ads necessarily, although I imagine that's something we'll want to pursue in the questions afterwards. Instead, I'm approaching them a little bit more in the way that Nana Verhoef and Clancy Wilmot have used the Nintendo DS and various artist projects as theoretical objects, as things which make statements about the world and are therefore productive things to think with. And I'm particularly interested in what these ads have to show about two things. And I'm going to look just at their visual content. None of them have voiceovers. They all have music soundtracks. And if anybody's particularly interested, I can say more about those at the end. But I'm going to be focusing on the visuals. I want to pay particular attention to the urban. I'm going to say something about how cities appear in the ads visually. But I'm also going to pay particular attention to the spatial organisation of the urban. As Jacob Gabery points out, computer graphics, and these images aren't entirely computer graphics, but I think there are elements of it in there. Computer graphics are primarily spatial. They're not visual. The spatial is not the same as the visual. So I want to try and unpack that and think a bit about the spatial organisation of these spaces in the ads. And I would like to propose that might be something of a critical method, perhaps, in relation to this project of advertising urban digital life. But secondly, all these adverts picture bodies that inhabit digitally mediated cities. And I want to bring an intersectional feminist lens into thinking about those bodies and what they're doing. Now, the current literatures on digital images and the spaces that they picture include a lot of work, for example, on animation, on digital 3D cinema, on visual effects in cinema and so on. And very little of that literature, or at least not that I've been able to find, if somebody knows, please let me know, but very little of it, it seems to me, has touched on how digital embodiments are about the remediation, invention and hierarchization of different bodily subjectivities and corporealities. So there's often quite a discussion about the body being entrained, perhaps in kind of post-phenomenological work or other approaches. But I think that body, talk about the body, is an abstraction. It's a theoretical abstraction which invisibilizes the very distinct embodiments through which this digitally mediated city is being visualized. And of course, if we think about other literatures, that's not at all surprising given the huge amounts of work on the imbrication of race, gender, sexuality and other embodiments in advertising, and also, of course, on the formations of race and gender on social media. So with Katie Warfield, Carolina Cambray and Crystal Aberdeen, I want to explore, to quote them, what happens when our conception of the classic fleshy and material body is made by the forces of mediation to be something other than or more than simply flesh. So I want to pay particular attention to the bodies in these adverts, which are other than flesh, and I want to examine how their visualizing articulates and enables the digital spaces that they're inhabiting. So let me start with the bodies. Ad from Spotify, released a few months ago in the US, and I'm sure it's obvious to many of you, I'm sure the cultural studies folks in the room are already hard at work decoding the ways in which this advert is inscribing all sorts of things onto the bodies that it pictures in order to render the Spotify app attractive to both users and advertisers. And this ad is typical for all the adverts I'll be showing you. There's a very striking consistency in the age, the gender and the racialization of the bodies that they show. So I'll start off by noting that almost all of the ads are examples of what Varghese and Kumar call femvertising. They define femvertising as advertising that employs pro-female talent, messages and imagery to empower women and girls. They note that it's increasingly common, and they suggest that it's a result of three things. One is a long history of various kinds of activism demanding more diverse, less stereotyped, and indeed just more women in advertising. It's also a result of what they describe as brand activism and conscious capitalism. It's not the most critical of papers I've read, so conscious capitalism, but also increasing scrutiny by regulatory bodies of gender roles and representations in advertising. So we might think of this ad in some ways as being very sort of 2021. It centres, as they almost all do, on the bodies of young women, especially young women of colour, as a means of responding to this growing expectation of diversity in advertising. And Spotify also emphasises that this ad was directed by a woman creative director. Now, as well as diversity, those young, slim, often black bodies are also working to visualise cool. Of course, they're conferring coolness on the product in order to sell it. And several scholars, including Bell Hooks and Lisa Nakamura, have written about how blackness is frequently used to figure cool, to sell all sorts of commodities. And Brandy Summers has made that argument in relation to urban renewal schemes in Washington, DC as well. Now, all of these adverts place these bodies in a location, the city, in which, of course, actual black bodies and women's bodies, and indeed other bodies, routinely face various kinds of surveillance, harassment, and violence. And given that all the ads show a very different relation to the city, one where simply by using an app you can apparently float free of all those earthly concerns, we might say that they're also picturing, perhaps saying, "Hey, you there," to what Sue Jackson has identified as the main constituency for this sort of post-feminism, which is, she argues, young women. So in their visual appearance, these ads seem to be playing a somewhat newer version of a quite old and familiar advertising game. They're associating or encoding positive values to their product, in this case by showing its use by cool young women. So in contrast to Riddell's argument then, that encoding model does seem to retain its purchase. Part of the newness of these advertising is their picturing of diversity, but I think another part is the special effects that are on show in these adverts, their digital visual effects. Those iridescent bubbles in the Spotify ad in particular emphasize one of the most technically difficult aspects of digital visual effects, which is the light, getting the light to look kind of right, to make it look realistic. So I think it's important to acknowledge that another thing that these bodies are displaying in these ads is the wonder of software itself. It's of the digital ability to create bubbles and to levitate bodies and to transform experiences of the urban. And there's a parallel here with film scholars who've noted a similar process in the use of visual effects in movies, where those visual effects both display amazing spectacles that are part of the narrative of the film, but they also display themselves as being amazing as well. A spectacle is both the scene and the technologies of its creation. So something else that we might say about these adverts then is about the kind of exuberance. I think there's a kind of exuberance in the creativity of the images themselves, of their bodily and spatial impossibilities, which are nonetheless digitally rendered as what Stephen Prince calls perceptual realism. But this also suggests that those adverts are related to the many instances of female figures being used to exemplify and calibrate visual technologies and digital technologies. So from colour film to computer graphics to computer games, women's bodies have been used to test and demonstrate the realism of visual technologies repeatedly. I've just been about halfway through Mary Ann Doan's new book, and she talks about how photographs of white women were used to make sure that film stock was consistently showing the same colour range in classical Hollywood movies, for example. So we might consider how that's happening here again, you know, women's bodies being made to demonstrate digital technical virtuosity. Having said all that, though, I do want to pause on the pleasure that these adverts promise. I think this technical bravado is pleasurable. It's kind of bubbles and portals, you know, they're kind of magical in a way, almost magical possibilities, all this flying around. It's long been a trope in movies, of course, but here it's being used to express a kind of bodily freedom and joy in the everyday, and for bodies for whom that is most often being denied. So I do want to acknowledge that there might indeed be some pleasure in seeing the potential, at very least, for living the city differently, for flying free in urban spaces, something that Lisa Nakamura comments on in passing in her discussion of what she calls volitional mobility. There's a pleasure generated by leaving the noise, the mess, the crowds, the rush, the threats of the city behind. And certainly my own little bit of geography and kind of critical urban digital geographies. There's a lot of critique of platforms in terms of the political economy of platforms, but I don't think there's enough attention being given to the pleasures that platforms can also offer, sometimes at least. And even if it's everyday, rather modest pleasures, listening to music, scrolling your feeds, going for a run, as we'll see in other adverts in a big city. And in the context of the digitally mediated city, I think it's also worth noting in these adverts that this pleasure is taken at leisure. These ads are in sharp contrast to the emphasis on speed and efficiency that you find in a lot of other adverts for urban digital technology, particularly in relation to kind of smart city tech, platform urbanism, and data analytics. There's a kind of slowness and fun that's missing very much from other kind of advertising. So, in my reading of these adverts at least, there are some pleasures to be found. But these women's bodies are also being pictured in very particular ways as cool, attractive, glamorous even, liberated, provided they use digital technologies. And they're also literally being made to exemplify the wonder of digital animation software. Okay, so that's my sort of first encounter with their ads and the picturing of urban digital life. So I want to turn now to thinking a bit more about the cities that they picture, or perhaps more accurately, the qualities of the urban that they evoke. Now, I've already noted that there are more and more digital images of urban spaces and bodies on various screens and surfaces in many urban locations and many domains of practice. A lot of scholars now are discussing smart and platform urbanism and emphasise the plethora of platforms, sensors, screens, apps, large and small, many of which are image intensive, that monitor city environments and hail us insistently, that harvest us, that get us and the urban environment as data. So there are social media platforms, of course, but there are also lots of much smaller local apps, I think, which we often don't pay much attention to. And there are smart city sensors monitoring things like traffic and air pollution and water levels and so on. Now, this saturation of the urban space with the ongoing generation of digital data is reorganising the spatiality and temporality of how cities are experienced, I think, and that's the theme of the Seeing the Cities Digitally book, as I've said. But it's a theme that's explored elsewhere, for example, in the work of Scott McQuire, who argues that this shift in the warp and weft of urban life is intensifying urban life, he says. It's speeding it up because of the constant ubiquitous availability of communication technologies and our continual use of them. However, quite a lot of discussion about this saturation of urban space with flows of digital data argues that at this point, it isn't just a question of ever faster and more extensive networks of data transfer. This is not just more intense time-space compression, for example. Instead, it has to be thought of in terms of a new kind of urban environment, something closer to an atmosphere than a network. Now, Nigel Thrift has been writing about this for really quite some time, and I think becoming more convincing actually as time goes on, exploring what he called the automatic production of space via pervasive data gathering, circulation and processing. And he uses terms more like envelopment, atmosphere, ether or an ambience to describe that. And Paul Frosch makes a similar point in relation to everyday social media use. He focuses on the ordinary, routine, embodied cohabitation with digital media, the kind of life that's pictured in these ads. And he suggests, and I quote, that this adjacency of mediated entities to our lives is often conveyed as a peripheral and background intuition, an embodied registration of ambient cohabitation, rather than a direct epiphany or passionate engagement. And he also suggests that in terms of looking at screens, it generates neither the intensity of spectatorship nor the instrumentality of observation. And it does strike me that these ads also picture an atmosphere, literally the air, as the place where digital life is lived most fully, most happily, most pleasurably, most freely, literally in the sky. Now, previous discussions of this sort of digital flying are focused on its prevalence in superhero movies and 3D cinema, I think. And certainly 3D cinema was the context for a really, still very excellent essay by Thomas Alsacer, where he offered an account of this kind of unanchored mobility. And he argued that unchaining the camera from its point of view in this constantly mobile embodiment is, he described it as the new default value of digital vision. So it's been connected to 3D film, also to superhero movies, and Scott Buchapman has talked quite particular ways about the masculinity of the flying superhero body in movies. And the other context these kind of flying bodies have been connected to is military surveillance and the view from a drone or a satellite. Again, this kind of flying view overlooking a landscape. I think the aerial mobility in these ads is a little bit different, though. I think what these ads suggest is that these flying bodies have moved from action movies to everyday adverts, to adverts about the everyday. Perhaps as software has become cheaper, more accessible, more available to ad agencies, as well as to Hollywood studios, and as they've started to sell everyday things to particular groups of consumers. And in the course of that shift to the everyday, those flying bodies have become female bodies. And I've also been gathering a whole bunch of adverts which also figure flying women. Although that's not a very productive Google search term, actually, flying women in adverts. So if anybody has any others that they're thinking of, please do send them to me. But there's quite a few of kind of, IKEA has one, various kind of banks offering mortgages and so on. Again, it's this flying female body seems to be really quite a recurrent trope. And it's a kind of domestication, I think, in a way, of this sort of flight. And moreover, I don't think these sorts of bodies are particularly about surveillance. They certainly don't look as if they're spectating intensely or observing instrumentally. They're mostly just kind of chilling out and having fun. So I think this is a kind of, as I say, a domesticated inhabitation of the digital atmospheric, one in which these bodies are rendering as cool and fun and pleasurable. So here there might be a connection to be made, and I need to think a bit more about this. Again, I'd be interested in any thoughts you have, to the current fascination, which is both academic and commercial, with atmosphere and volume, with the enthusiasm for immersive urban experiences for other kinds of bodies. Now, immersion currently seems to mean an awful lot of different things, but I'm thinking, I guess, of persistent efforts at 3D immersion in digital images of cities in particular, things like Google Earth going 3D, the sale of three-dimensional models of actual and imagined cities for planners, architects, games designers, filmmakers. I'm thinking of the popularity of flight simulators in 2D and 3D virtual reality. I'm thinking of the new iPhones, thanks to Maria who put me onto this. The new iPhones have LiDAR, laser detection technology embedded in them, and also photogrammetry apps, so you can make 3D models with your new iPhone. Right, so I just see here. There are 3D billboards. You can Google that on YouTube. That certainly comes up with some interesting results. And these kind of tourist immersive experiences as well. There are a couple in Richmond at the minute that I'm planning to visit soon. So we seem to be in a sort of 3D moment, and I think these ads, although of course they're two-dimensional images, seem to be participating in this kind of volumetric interest. So we've got atmospheres, and we've got these particular kind of bodies inhabiting volumetric digital atmospheres rather than city streets or cafes or offices. But we've also got bubbles and portals. And one of the really important aspects of the materiality, of the digital materiality of these images, is that their materiality includes what connects them to all those digital infrastructure, the sensors, the smartphones, the servers, the data centers, the Wi-Fi networks, and so on and so forth. And this is what Adrian Mackenzie and Anna Munster recently described as the invisuality of digital images. So the materiality of these images doesn't just reside in their visual content and the format of their display, which is kind of what we're used to with non-digital images, but it also resides in the code that makes them visible on a screen, that makes them shareable, that makes them searchable, that makes them always available for platformatization. And their invisuality is what embeds these digital images in the screens through which they flow in a material urban infrastructure. And this returns us once again to the harvesting by platforms of data. Mackenzie and Munster talk about platform seeing as a corollary of invisuality. And for them, platform seeing is about how about user data, but also image data, is collated and analysed by platform algorithms, and they're particularly interested in the role of non-human vision in this process, in the service of platform corporations' various efforts to make profits. Now, we frequently hear the claim that this invisuality is invisible, and it's often remarked that we don't or we can't see digital infrastructure, whether that's the software or code in devices or that digital infrastructure in the city. Now, I'm not sure that's true, actually. I think there are quite a few projects around, often undertaken actually by artists or activists or designers, that try to make the work of digital devices visible, to try and make that infrastructure apparent. So I'm thinking, for example, of James Bridle's Render Ghosts project, Shannon Mattern in her more journalistic and her tweeting work. Alison Powell is a sociologist in London who runs walks that look for data centres and cables and cell phones and so on. And Sarah Barnes, indeed, has suggested that this apparent opacity is cultivated by platforms in order to shield them from scrutiny rather than any quality inherent to their working. So I think that invisibility depends a bit more on what you're looking for. And in particular, perhaps, on the spatial organisation of the visuals that you're looking at. So if we look at these ads a little differently, I think we might be able to see some indications of at least some of that infrastructural invisuality. And I'm going to pause just for a moment to let folk... No, that's okay. Okay. Now these adverts don't, I think, suggest their infrastructural connections by showing pictures of the tubes of the internet, it's true, or even by filling the air with indications of radio waves or Wi-Fi or something. But they do strongly suggest, I think, that urban spatiality can include radical shifts from one place, even from one form of life, one possibility to another. So bubbles can take you to a different zone. You can leap through portals or even literally flip through your social media feeds. And we're back here once again to the question of special effects, which I now want to specify a little bit more precisely as animation. Now, animation in the simple sense, of course, refers just to moving images, and these images certainly move from the flying that they picture to their almost constantly moving points of view, all the way down to the energetics of their constantly refreshing screens. And also, and more importantly, I think they're animated in Deborah Levitt's sense of showing things that morph and transform, things that occupy and generate new spatial and temporal organisations of the visual field and of cities and of bodies. Now, the dominant spatial organisation of urban space, certainly in the West historically, has been Cartesian and through particular perspective as a technique of picturing three-dimensional space on two-dimensional surfaces. But it seems to me that the spatiality of these portals and bubbles is quite different from, let's say, the Google geolocative gaze, which locates the user in two-dimensional Cartesian space using the latitude and longitude, in Google Maps and Google Street View, and in the innumerable forms of spatial media that use that geometry as their base map. And I know we've got experts in the room, I know Clancy and Emma and so as people are sitting around, so I'm sure there'll be more comments on that perhaps in the discussion. That particular Cartesian geometricization of space also structures the newer 3D mediations of urban space, I think very many of which assume a three-dimensional space based on the coordinates given by X, Y, and Z axes. Now, these ads do picture those kind of spaces, perspectively organised, but they also show us other kinds of spaces. Anna Secor would describe their organisation of urban space as topological. Topological space is relational, she says. It distorts, it morphs and transforms without breaking. And in particular, in Secor's reading, topological spaces enfold insides and outsides. Now, as Secor says, there are different kinds of relationalities and politics articulated by different kinds of topological instances. I don't think there's a kind of inherent critique necessarily in spotting a sort of topological space. Secor does wonder whether topological spaces, she says, speak about what we want but fail to get from our stubbornly fixed cities, our cities that don't seem to consent to the power of our desires, which returns us to the potential for pleasure in these adverts, I think, rather nicely. But I want to offer another reading of the topologies in these adverts and suggest that what's happening in these weird bubbles and portals is potentially a sense of urban space as non-Cartesian with portal potential, showing bodies entering into new kinds of spaces via their use of apps, spaces that are themselves evidently digitally rendered. Now, according to Francesco Cossetti, screens, especially the screens of phones and laptops and smart TVs and desktops and so on, are no longer surfaces on which reality is relived. Rather, they've become transit hubs for the images that circulate in our social space. They serve to capture these images, to make them momentarily available for someone somewhere before they embark again on their journey. And this sense that screens are transit hubs that connect to other spaces, to other places, experiences, kind of figures the spatiality of the digital urban not as an extended mappable network or an infrastructure perhaps, but as something mottled with openings and digital openings to other locations. And rather, as I've suggested, that their enthusiasm for aerial spaces might speak to the atmospheric saturation of contemporary cities with digital flows, I think these topological geometries might also indicate at least some of the connective invisuality that's inherent to the digital visual mediation of space. That spatial organisation kind of thinks about the outside of the image as well as what we can see in its inside. Again, what I've been trying to do in this second, more extended encounter with these adverts is to articulate the work that they're doing, this time less in relation to the encoding of their bodies and more to the city spatialities that they picture, this kind of volumetric three-dimensionality, but also perhaps a kind of topological space. I now want to think a bit more and fairly briefly about the bodies in these adverts and add one more layer to what I think now is quite a complex articulation of digitally mediated urbanism. And I want to focus a little bit on the space of the bodies themselves now in the ads. Now, another thing that strikes me about these adverts is their persistent individualization of the bodies that they show. So in that Spotify ad that I started with, there are only single bodies in those bubbles, apart from one couple. The running shoe ad shows the body as a stable point, while everything else around it kind of splinters and fragments. There's the single body that crashed through the glass ceiling in the banking app, and the single body that flew through the new urban redevelopment. Now, this singular corporeal massy body onto whose surface and volume specific meanings can be inscribed both epidermally and kinetically, I would say, is what Patricia Tichenito-Clough has called the massy bounded body as organism. And this is the body onto which signs of age, of gender, of race can be rendered to make meaning. And if, as we've seen, particular signs are rendered on those bodies consistently and repeatedly. But I think their various forms of individualized isolation are also undoubtedly picturing the individual user of an app who generates data to be harvested by the platform. However, there are also crowds in some of these adverts. Several of the ads show the urban crowd in the street or the office or the queue as something to be escaped from. But this video is a reminder that platforms also need certain kinds of crowds. They need lots of data from actions or from changes of state, quite Wendy Chun, from embodied actions or changes of state by many different users to be useful. And of course, this is what generates so much criticism of the platforms. This is the harvesting of data that they use to make profits. They're got you. So platforms need individual users, but they need lots of them. Now, 19th century accounts of the crowd in modern cities saw the crowd as some kind of supra-individual animalistic organisms with kind of uncontrollable urges. This is a highly classed, racialized and gendered reading of the urban crowd. And it's interesting that this ad continues to use an animal analogy again to picture its version of the digital crowd. But just as the flying body seems to have been tamed, so too this crowd is now, I think, a rather unthreatening, although I have to say slightly weird for me anyway, spectacle of a murmuration of birds. Having said that, though, actually, literally today, I found a blog post, which I've subsequently seen tweeted, which actually talks about online mobs, quote, which is, I think, a 19th century evocation of the crowd, and uses the murmuration of birds, again, as an analogy for this kind of, not maybe subhuman, kind of form of collective well, I would say collective intelligence. The gist of the ad, of course, it wasn't intelligence. It was kind of animal behaviour that crowds were doing online. So I think this is, say, a bit odd, but not less threatening. Again, we can discuss that. I think what's more significant, though, perhaps, other than my views of animals as substituting for crowds, is the way that this accumulation of individuals' data is shown as creating patterns in the sky. You know, that's why murmuration has been adopted, I think. That's the wonder of these bird clouds, right? They're airborne patterns, which is rather like the machine learning algorithms that run on big data and which are central to Mackenzie and Munster's version of platform seeing, as well as to the form of the social offered by this ad, which is about social investing. I thought social investing was like investing for social good. What this ad is doing is basically saying you can invest more wisely if you copy what everybody else is investing in. So you're investing by pattern following rather than by making sort of rational decisions about what to invest in. So it's a rather particular version of the social that's being pitched here. It's also a diverse marketplace, and I think this recurrence of diversity as a term is also very, very interesting across many of the things that I've been looking at. So I think what this final ad is suggesting is that given enough data, enough crowds, an entirely different kind of urban life might emerge, morphing and pattern-based, once again high in the clouds above the pictured city. Now the next thing I'd like to do as part of this project, and I haven't really started to do this with any kind of sort of systematic rigour, I'm not sure if this is terribly systematic or rigorous either, but is to extend this consideration of the pattern-based production of human life in digitally mediated urban environments to a different, but I think potentially related set of visuals, which are images of urban individuals and crowds which are generated computationally entirely from human behavioural data. So rather than thinking about the bodies that are made to emerge, so rather than thinking about bodies that are pictured generating data, this is about the bodies that are made to emerge from what machines learn about human changes of movement and state. So if the machines have got us, my next question, I guess, now is literally what do they make of us? So I'm just going to show you this and then kind of leave that as an open question before I conclude. So this is another kind of advert. It's the landing page for a San Francisco-based company called Synthesis AI. And what Synthesis AI are selling are human models generated by machine learning techniques created by the guy who wrote the book on synthetic data for deep learning, which is pretty much what their website says. And what they're selling is these apparently highly realistic figures, realistic both visually and in terms of their bodily behaviour, to test other kinds of software, for example, facial recognition software, or to model driver behaviour for testing driverless cars without actually putting any sort of carbon-based body in an actual car. Or indeed, apparently, to design realistic avatars for your immersions in the metaverse or in virtual reality. The company, very interestingly, the company claims, I'm saying it's interesting, I think that there's a certain kind of politics that's becoming a little more visible in these kind of things now, diversity, but this company also claims that this is both more capable and more ethical computer vision. And I think it's claiming that it's ethical simply because all this is done without using any actual humans, which is a very particular version of what ethical means, I think. But this kind of production of entirely digital human bodies, I think is possibly going to be difficult to research because these are very commercially valuable kinds of processes. But certainly there was an Oxford company who was bought by Waymo in 2019 who modelled pedestrian behaviour to train driverless cars in how to recognise what pedestrians do. So, as I say, I'm beginning to run out of time, so I'm going to leave that there as a sort of something we might like to pick up perhaps in discussion. Let me conclude. Macquarie argues that urban space has been a key site for the emergence of a new condition in which the experimental spatialisation of digital media infrastructure has proceeded hand in hand with the heightened role of spatial logics in organising information. And for this reason, the city needs to be recognised as an object, inspiring the development of new approaches based on computational analysis of continuous data flows as the means to mastering complex socio-spatial systems. Now, this reconfiguration of cities and their management via many kinds of data flows, and I think Macquarie there is thinking more of the kind of smart city, Internet of Things, turning urban environments into data. But there's also, it's also true, I think, of the production of the harvesting of data by social media platforms. This reconfiguration of cities is not simply a technical experiment, though. It's also a cultural or discursive project, I would say, that's accompanied by many kinds of visuals, including these sorts of adverts, which are selling the everyday devices of that digital media infrastructure to consumers, but also showing us, you know, what that kind of digital life will be like. And what I've been doing this evening is working through just a handful of those adverts to consider what they tell us specifically about the bodies in these digitally mediated cities. Now, Jacob Gabery reminds us that computational images are not pictures of the things they represent. They're pictures of the world that produce them, and they execute a theory of that world in the world. So I guess another way to describe what I've been doing is to ask what theories about those worlds, those urban worlds, do these adverts articulate? And it's apparent, it seems to me, that part of their theorization is that some women are allowed a very particular relationship to this everyday digital urban life. They're allowed to be consumers, they're allowed to have fun, they're allowed to look good, to be cool, even perhaps to be liberated in some kind of way. But they're also kind of domesticated. Now, not literally, this is 2022 after all, although we might recall the arrival point for the woman flying through that urban redevelopment is a kind of other women with children sort of scene. But rather they are being tamed, I think, in relation to superficially similar figures in other parts of visual culture. Their flight is playful and quite sort of low-key. This is not the kind of superhero types of flight. They're not surveilling all that they see. They're not being given a god or even a goddess trick. And they are also being given a very intimate relation to their technology, I think, which isn't something I've said a lot about, but it seems to me that their technology kind of absorbs and surrounds them rather than them controlling it. So that there's a different kind of relationality there. So more generally, their bodies, and these were at some point actual filmed bodies, or at least part of the adverts were, have been rendered as surfaces onto which a form of urban life can be projected. And this reminds me of the long history of women's bodies being used as allegories or symbols in public sculpture in cities, and also of Mary Ann Doan's discussion of how in cinema women's bodies are so often understood as only surface. As she says, women are often simply there to be envisaged. And these ads extend that envisaging from women's two-dimensional surfaces to their three-dimensional mass, digitally rendering them physically malleable as well, folding, flexing, flying, and porting. Now, in the context of the broader racialized gendering of this visual field, I want to acknowledge that this deployment of women's bodies in particular means that black men then become almost entirely invisible in this digital cityscape and its theorization of the world. And the visualization of that urban freedom offered to these ads by women, though, has some new aspects. That partly the picturing of black women's bodies, but also that freedom is about escaping the confines of the city, of its public spaces and its rituals. This is no longer just the freedom to be able to move through the everyday city unhindered. This isn't really a feminist version of that lure of the department store or the cinema 100 years ago. Rather, it's to leave the city streets entirely and to drift through these aerial spaces, these new geometries, through portals and splintered surfaces entirely untethered. Now, there might be some critical potential for audiences and their embodiments here in the pleasure that this picturing might afford. As Sakura argues in her discussion of topological spaces, topologies can articulate different kinds of relations. It might also be a way to see or to indicate the way the digital devices are always plugged into infrastructures, often platforms, but not always. So seeing topologically might be a way to bring those infrastructures into the visual field, not through picturing them, but through its spatial organization. But if we are thinking topologically in relation to these images, trying to bring their outsides in, if we're trying to map their constitutive externalities as well as their internal forms of organization, another visual absence I think it's imperative to mark is that of white masculinity. There are very, very few white male bodies on display in these ads, chilling and merging with their tech. In fact, it's really only the finance app that focuses on white men's bodies, and I think we can elaborate that. But I do wonder whether, thinking topologically, the spectacularity of the special effects in these ads does somehow point to or indicate the world from which they were made. Going back to that Gabery point that these are picturing not what they think they're picturing, they're actually picturing the world that they came from. So perhaps those special effects point to the worlds of advertising and visual effects and computer games, the industries that produce those things, and the norms through that those worlds are structured through. And again, that suggests that we have to look at these ads not just as visuals, but also as spatialized connections towards the norms of their spaces of production, as well as their spaces of circulation. And perhaps then the implicit embodiments against which these visibilized bodies are created might also be part of what we see. So thank you. I'll stop there. Thanks. I'll shuffle across. Could you pass me the cup of water, please? Oh, sorry, I can grab it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so great. So what we'll do just to begin with is I'll give a little response to Gillian's talk, and then we'll open up for questions. So if you think that you will have a question, you have 5 minutes or so to formulate that and be ready. I mean, I don't think we'll have time for everyone's questions given the room, but just take your time to formulate your question. So yeah, thank you for that, Gillian. There's so much going on there, and I think being familiar with your work over the years, I can see a whole range of things kind of coming together, particularly the work on the visual and the digital and then kind of urban all in one place. So there are quite a few, many different things that, but just gathering my thoughts, one of the things that strikes me just responding to the adverts that you were showing is you described it as being untethered, right? So you have all of these people floating around. But I would describe it maybe as ungrounded. And it's really interesting in the way that you think about, for example, the history of film as this site where the city is first represented in a way that's accessible to a kind of everyday audience. And you described that maybe even the audience isn't that important here for the analysis, but in those kinds of particularly early films, so you think about someone like Walter Benjamin and this question that film takes people out of their factories, out of their prison worlds of kind of banality and casts them into a kind of open rubble space almost to I think the quote is to calmly and adventurously go travelling, right, by seeing the city represented back to them. But here, rather than showing people the city as a site where they might go and walk around and be grounded, it's actually pulling people up out of the city, and it's not just even untethering them, but ungrounding them in that material kind of existence. And so what I see there is really what I would think of as kind of maybe metaversal imaginaries as well. So it's very much the same thing that you see with Facebook or Roblox or other sort of companies that are interested in this idea of a fully fledged kind of virtual reality that you would prefer over the banal kind of everyday. And you see that with the banking ad in particular, where the bank is just tedious and it's full of paper and it's got a clock and you have to kick the clock and then you're going to float up and smash the glass ceiling, and there's all of this kind of cynical deployment of progressive kind of symbolism as well. So I think I have a kind of question there about whether that ungroundedness has then something to do with this wider digital aesthetic about realities, different realities. So that was one of the questions that I had. And the other one, which is something that I've been thinking about for a long time and don't really have an answer for, so I'm going to ask you, even though I know it's not an easy one, is why does the digital, it's a very, very large conceptual frame, but the digital, in the most general sense, seem to be so obsessed with the rendering of the city, that the city we think of as being this modernist kind of figure or this modernist trope, but it's also very strongly a digital trope. And, do you have any guesses, having done this for quite a long time, as to, why is the digital as maybe a form, as an aesthetic, as a framing, so obsessed with re-rendering or reimagining or recasting the city in all of these different kinds of ways? I don't know whether you have a guess or an informed answer for that as well. So those are my two questions, and then again, give people time to formulate questions, and we'll go to the room after that.
Okay, thank you, Emma. Yeah, so I think in flagging that connection to other kinds of three-dimensional things, I didn't mention the metaverse robot was, but I should have done. I agree with you. I think that this is all part of something that's going on at the moment, a broader context, and that's why I think I'm sort of envisaging this larger project as a set of sort of linked case studies that would try to speak to that broader context without sort of overgeneralizing too much, because I think these are doing, these different visuals are doing slightly different things. The question of why the digital is obsessed with the city is really interesting. I mean, my immediate reaction is because that's where the markets are, actually, which is not a very sort of sort of culturally inflected answer. But I think cities are where consumers cluster most intensively, and also in terms of I didn't say much about smart urbanism as a thing. I don't know where sort of people in the room are of quite what that's referring to. But one way of understanding this saturation of urban spaces with digital sensors and this idea that you can manage cities better by working with big data sets and combining big data sets and then figuring out efficiencies and sustainabilities. There's a fantastic book by Simon Marvin and Andres Lucayala called Urban OS. And they basically say that the big software corporations in the 80s had these sort of softwares for managing systems of systems, and they'd sold them to all the really big corporations who had systems of systems. How to add your wage system to your stationary control system, to your lighting, energy supply system. The corporations who operated that at scale, they'd sold, it was a full market. So they looked around and said, well, what other systems of systems are there that we can sell this stuff to? And they came up with a city. The city, and if you look at the visuals for smart city tech, it's about transport as a system, energy as a system, waste as a system, crowds as a system, and the smart city idea is that you can put all these together. So in that sense, I think there's a commercial imperative to look at cities. But I think there's also a wider history of cinema also being so interested in the urban as this sort of site for sort of thinking about what it is to be modern and for thinking through difference and social identity and so on. So there's probably a better, more sustained answer as well to be developed.
Yeah. It does make me wonder about the work of someone like James Donald on imagining the modern city, and that maybe there's some kind of legitimacy there at work that if you're trying to produce or create in a medium that you want to appear serious in some kind of way, that maybe you have to deal with the city, because that is again this kind of master trope that we have. But yeah, I mean, lots more to say on that, but I think we should let the room ask some questions. So we've got one very quick hand up there. I think you were by far the quickest, so we'll start with you, but I will ask you to speak up for the recording, and then I'll repeat the question back if I can as well.
Is this kind of bodily liberation possible in the third world city? And if the third world city, which is obviously has what would aspects of not really pre-modernity, but of pre-post-modernity, so like of various degrees of time and space, be able to encompassate something like the advertisement for Spotify, because I think there was an advertisement for Spotify on Delhi similarly, but again it wasn't this. So this is sort of my question, if this is for the first world city.
Yeah, so I'll paraphrase that question. That's a really excellent question. Thank you. So the question is, why is this the first world city? It's very much the city of modernity, particularly thinking about this question of bodily liberation. Is this something, for example, the Spotify ad that could be easily translated into, I think the term used was a pre-post-modernity city, particularly in relation to things like time and space?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Very geographical question, actually. And I think that's at the beginning. Am I interested in the city? Is this some kind of abstraction? Urbanism, cities, particular cities? I think actually the city that's pictured in these ads isn't even really the first world city. It's actually a kind of, should I say, US skyscraper city, perhaps. Although I certainly recognise the bank queue. That felt very, very English to me. I don't know. So I think these are particular urban locations, and they're not suburban either. So I think that they're very particular, actually, the kinds of urban environments that they're picturing. And I think maybe this comes back to maybe even questions of what the sort of not to pun, but sort of maybe the cultural capital involved in the urban is very particular. As you say, it's not evenly distributed across all the cities in the world, and it's not even evenly distributed across the particular cities that make it as the cool cities that you live your cool digital life in. So there's definitely a particularity of the urban environment that's being pictured here, and in a fuller version of this account I will think more about that and address it more directly. So thank you, that was a great question.
I can certainly imagine a project that thinks about, the localization of different Spotify ads and how they represent cities differently, right?
I do wonder whether, why there's no voiceover in these ads, though, actually, whether that does make them, in theory at least, more, it opens them to a broader geographical audience than would be the case. Certainly if they start to circulate on social media, national advertising becomes quite tricky.
Okay, so I have one. This is quite good. You're pacing yourselves quite well. So I've got one question just here.
Thank you. And Professor Rose, thank you so much for the presentation. I am a visiting scholar from the University of British Columbia, and I can attest to the fact that your work is well talked about in the field of architecture. It's, to me, too, it feels so easy to interpret the ads that you presented to us as sort of a generative map of urban space. Something that you might see from James Corner, for example. But I'm wondering, a lot of what is generated from these depictions is a very utopian image.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about the way that this plays into kind of who is represented in these spaces, I'm wondering, what agency does this utopian imagery have on feminist placemaking in our physical but increasingly digitized space?
I have to summarize the question. Let me just finish my notes so that I capture the question. There's this one way that we can interpret the ads as a generative map of urban space, but of course they're very, very utopian kind of representations. And there's a question then of who is represented, what kind of agency is there, and especially if we're thinking about feminist kind of interpretations of digital kind of life or digital worlds. Where would we go from there?
Yeah. So I one of the reasons I wasn't sure whether this was a good talk to give was because I think in a way that these are easy things to work with, right? I think you're right. They offer a very, particularly in some ways, quite familiar account of this sort of urbanism. I think, in the spirit of sort of early feminist cultural studies, I think I did want to hold on to the fact that I think I at least find some pleasure and sort of a sense of joy in some of these adverts, even though I know also that they are kind of ridiculously utopian and post-feminist in all the ways that I'm sure we'd agree with. I think that sense of, there's something about just being able to go for a run or eating a chocolate bar or scroll through your phone screen in an urban space where you're absolutely free to do that. It's a fantasy in the ads, but it's a fantasy in real life as well. And I think picturing, sort of having that ordinariness visualized is I think, there are different ways to take it. In terms of actually sort of practically building a kind of feminist urban space, I think these ads might actually work better as perhaps critique rather than offering a sort of more substantial. And there is a new book out, I think, called Affirmative Aesthetics, which really tries to suggest that this mobility is something that we should all be working towards and trying to access and gain. Certainly when I've thought about the mobility that smart cities advocate really, really persistently, there's very little attention being given to the different embodiments that, say, people who aren't particularly able to be mobile have. So I'm not going to kind of say, well, we should all just be mobile, and that's a really positive thing for feminists. I do, though, think that this sense of a sort of place of production of these things, where are they coming from? Whose imaginations are guiding all sorts of shapings of the city, not only in these kind of creative industries, also in the tech industry that does the smart city stuff persistently. We see a lot of these critiques emerging in relation to AI, of course, at the moment as well, but also, potentially in architecture as well. When I worked with the architects on that big urban redevelopment project, the kind of, the masculine performativity of much of the architecture world was absolutely shocking to me, and I think produces very particular kinds of urban visions as well. So I think maybe maybe not positive prescriptions for feminists, but maybe there are more forms of critique perhaps available in these ads if we look at them a little differently.
Okay, so yeah, Maria.
Whenever I click on anything, there's all these cookies that are attached to it, and so there's a whole digital profile, and so I'm constantly getting advertisements that do in some way reinforce or represent like the young, cool, hip, and black kind of gendered body. And so I'm thinking about like methods for scholars to go about looking at these digital computational products, and if you think, well, maybe I'm not seeing like a white male figure because I'm not feeding in that sort of like, I'm not being read as a user that would consume that. Or if we, as scholars, maybe need to play around with methods of creating fictitious identities, or just creating, getting a new cell phone, like a burner phone for scholars studying maybe our advertisements to try to spoof like a white male embodiment. So I'm wondering about, well, this is where my mind is going. So I'm wondering about how we know that we're kind of getting a capacious view of what these advertisements are doing in like different social strata. The second one is, I'm also interested in these computational objects. I was thinking the whole time back in my mind, like follow the money, or I was like follow the data. Like, is there a way we could like stain our data, or stain it and try to trace where it goes and how it's being deployed? I don't know if that's possible. Maybe that's like the blockchain people, or not, but maybe that's the purpose. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about ways that, especially public scholars, can kind of look at these privatized databases and try to like speculate about this larger infrastructure. And then I guess, the last thing I wanted to ask is, how can we maintain or still think critically about how images are being deployed and used? Because I kept thinking about your first advertisement, the one with like the black woman with like larger hair, and I also kept thinking about like, okay, well, what if it was like that type of situated perspective from her embodiment? And I'm like, well, as someone who has that hair, I actually feel like I'm constantly being watched. So there was this juncture in what I saw in the advertisement, how she was being deployed and used, and also my own experience of like, actually, when you wear your hair this way in an urban space, you're actually hyper visible. And it's something that you don't really want to let others know, but you're constantly being watched and tracked in a way that the advertisement wasn't necessarily authentic to, or didn't kind of portray that sense of, so now I'm kind of thinking, well, I kind of know who made that advertisement, not someone who has that type of hair. So I was thinking about how we can maintain that sort of criticality about perspective of these images, and also just like the methods questions. So hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, I'm going to try to summarize this. So I feel like there are 4 points here. The final one is really how do we maintain criticality with respect to the different methods that we can deploy in this kind of research. But one of the things that was suggested is, okay, so if you're trying to do research on different users and how different profiles and kind of data profiles that you might have will have different media or different adverts coming to them? Can we, for example, spoof white male kind of subjectivity by maybe having a research methodology that helps us to do that? How do we know that we've actually got a sufficiently capacious view if we're using some of these methods, particularly when we're interpreting things like visual advertising? This idea of staining data, so tracking data, I think that's quite a technical sort of question. But how can public scholars kind of work with private databases, I feel like is that kind of question. So that's how I've boiled it down, at least.
Yeah, great. Fantastic questions again. Thank you. So to take them in the order that you listed, the question about sort of the fact that the adverts will be directed. So I found the adverts by going onto YouTube and Vimeo. And while there are YouTube channels that you can follow, subscribe to if you're interested in adverts, I can't remember how I came across the Spotify, probably on Twitter, the Spotify one originally, and that kind of sent me off and realising that there were others. I saw a couple on TV, I think, as well. But they didn't come to me through my feeds. And I think that's one reason, and they do, you're absolutely right. These are directed adverts. It's not the same as broadcast media TV, although they may also be shared that way. So I think that was one reason why I wanted to hesitate before sort of assuming things about what audiences would say, because figuring out who the audience is tricky, and also how they look at these adverts. I was giving them these incredibly, maybe too much attention, whereas I think if you're scrolling through and you may just very casually glance at them. In terms of trying to sort of jinx that address through the cookies and the algorithms and so on, that is actually something that Richard Rogers suggests that you should do in his book on digital methods. So Richard Rogers runs summer schools in Amsterdam every year on trying to experiment with different sorts of social science research methods that can really get to grips with the particularities of these digital objects. So if anybody's really into it, I recommend them. They're great. You kind of workshop different sorts of methods. He basically kind of says, well, if you want to use Google search, for example, to look for images, you have to start with a fresh Google account, because otherwise Google will the results that you get will do exactly what you've just been describing, which is send you stuff on the basis of what you've already looked at in the past in Google. The idea of sort of trying to mimic somebody else in order to get adverts, that's really interesting. And I know there are all these things now about authentic. I was just thinking about Twitter. I mean, would you have to have like a Twitter parody account? Maybe I don't know quite what Elon might think of you if you were trying to. That's a really interesting thing to think through. I don't know of anybody who's tried it, but not to say that it shouldn't be. I do know one or two projects that have tried to trace digital data through. In fact, one project looking at smart technologies in Santiago de Chile. In the transport system, this is Ignacio Perez, who's a PhD student at Oxford. What he found was that a lot of the technical people running these systems don't actually understand where the data flows to and from either. So some kind of technical stain on the data would be really interesting. I mean, you would think that geolocation would be something easy to track, but I don't think that's the case either. So I think there's some real technical issues there, but it would be fascinating, this circulation, because then maybe we could almost literally map it. I don't think that's technically possible at the minute. And just so I'm conscious of time, so I'm rushing on, but very briefly, I agree with you about that Spotify advert. Actually, in fact, looking at it again this morning, there was something about the almost excessive kind of physicality of that body and the kind of the bending and the dancing. Also the fact that she manages to carry a handbag through the whole thing. I did start to wonder about that actually and start to get less comfortable with it. And I think there is something about my own viewing position of these adverts as well that I think I need to think a little bit more through when I start hopefully to develop this into a longer piece of work. So thanks for prompting me to think through that.
Okay, great. So I think we're just over time now, so I think we should finish up. So firstly, I'll give you instructions about the food in a moment. But firstly, let's thank Gillian again. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you.